Hello friends, welcome to the second part of this video. As informed earlier, topic now is GDP. First part was about inflation. If you haven't viewed it yet, you can check it by clicking on the above link. So let's start with the word GDP. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. It is the total monetary or market value of all the finished goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period. As a broad measure of overall domestic production, it functions as a comprehensive scorecard of a given country's economic health. The calculation of a country's GDP encompasses all private and public consumption, government outlays, investments, additions to private inventories, paid-in construction costs, and the foreign balance of trade. Balance of trade is difference between the value of a country's exports and the value of a country's imports for a given period. Balance of trade is the largest component of a country's balance of payments. Sometimes the balance of trade between a country's goods and the balance of trade between its services are distinguished as two separate figures. The balance of trade is also referred to as the trade balance, the international trade balance, commercial balance, or the net exports. Of all the components that make up a country's GDP, the foreign balance of trade is especially important. The GDP of a country tends to increase when the total value of the goods and services that domestic producers sell to foreign countries exceeds the total value of foreign goods and services that domestic consumers buy. When this situation occurs, a country is said to have a trade surplus. So the trade balance is equal to total value of exports minus total value of imports. If the opposite situation occurs, if the amount that domestic consumers spend on foreign products is greater than the total sum of what domestic producers are able to sell to foreign consumers, it is called a trade deficit. In this situation, the GDP of a country tends to decrease. GDP can be computed on a nominal basis or a real basis, the latter accounting for inflation. Overall, real GDP is a better method for expressing long-term national economic performance since it uses constant dollars. So what is constant dollar? It is an adjusted value of a currency used to compare dollar values from one period to another. Due to inflation, the purchasing power of the dollar changes over time. So in order to compare dollar values from one year to another, they need to be converted from nominal dollar values to constant dollar values. Constant dollar value may also be referred to as real dollar value. Constant dollar calculation will be like this. Second year constant dollar value is equal to FYDV into CPI2 by CPI1, where FYDV stands for first year dollar value, CPI2 is consumer price index for second year, and CPI1 is consumer price index for first year. Now, a little history of GDP. The concept of GDP was first proposed in 1937 in a report to the US Congress in response to the Great Depression, conceived of and presented by an economist at the National Bureau of Economic Research, Simon Kuznets. At the time, the preeminent system of measurement was GNP. After the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, GDP was widely adopted as a standard means for measuring national economies. However, the US continued to use GNP as its official measure of economic welfare until 1991, after which it switched to GDP. Beginning in the 1950s, however, some economists and policymakers began to question GDP. Some observed, for example, a tendency to accept GDP as an absolute indicator of nation's failure or success, despite its failure to account for health, happiness, inequality, and other constituent factors of public welfare. In other words, these critics drew attention to a distinction between economic progress and social progress. However, most authorities like Arthur Okun, an economist for President John F. Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors, held firm to the belief that GDP is an absolute indicator of economic success, claiming that for every increase in GDP, there would be a corresponding drop in unemployment. Types of gross domestic product. GDP can be reported in several ways, each of which provides slightly different information. First one is nominal GDP, second real GDP, third GDP per capita, fourth GDP growth rate, fifth GDP purchasing power parity. Now let's talk about GDP formula. GDP can be determined via three primary methods. All three methods should yield the same figure when correctly calculated. These three approaches are often termed the expenditure approach, the output or production approach, and the income approach. The expenditure approach, which is also known as the spending approach, calculates spending by the different groups that participate in the economy. This approach can be calculated using the following formula. GDP is equal to C plus G plus I plus NX, where C is equal to consumption, G is equal to government spending, I is equal to investment, and NX is equal to net exports. All these activities contribute to the GDP of a country. The production or output approach. The production approach is essentially the reverse of the expenditure approach. Instead of measuring the input costs that contribute to economic activity, the production approach estimates the total value of economic output and deducts the cost of intermediate goods that are consumed in the process, like those of materials and services. Whereas the expenditure approach projects forward from costs, the production approach looks backward from the vantage point of a state of completed economic activity. The income approach. It represents a kind of middle ground between the two other approaches to calculating GDP. The income approach calculates the income earned by all the factors of production in an economy, including the wages paid to labor, the rent earned by land, the return on capital in the form of interest, and corporate profits. Although GDP is a widely used metric, there are other ways of measuring the economic growth of a country. While GDP measures the economic activity within the physical borders of a country, whether the producers are native to that country or foreign-owned entities, gross national product is a measurement of the overall production of people or corporations native to a country, including those based abroad. GNP excludes domestic production by foreigners. Gross national income is another measure of economic growth. It is the sum of all income earned by citizens or nationals of a country, regardless of whether the underlying economic activity takes place domestically or abroad. The relationship between GNP and GNI is similar to the relationship between the production output approach and income approach used to calculate GDP. GNP uses the production approach while GNI uses the income approach. With GNI, the income of a country is calculated as its domestic income plus its indirect business taxes and depreciation, as well as its net foreign factor income. The figure for net foreign factor income is calculated by subtracting all payments made to foreign companies and individuals from all payments made to domestic businesses. In an increasingly global economy, GNI has been put forward as a potentially better metric for overall economic health than GDP, because certain countries have most of their income withdrawn abroad by foreign corporations and individuals. Their GDP figure is much higher than the figure that represents their GNI. Criticisms of GDP. There are, of course, drawbacks to using GDP as an indicator. In addition to the lack of timeliness, some criticisms of GDP as a measure are: it ignores the value of informal or unrecorded economic activity. It is geographically limited in a globally open economy. It emphasizes material output without considering overall well-being. It ignores business-to-business activity. It counts costs and waste as economic benefits. Finally, global sources for country GDP data. The World Bank hosts one of the most reliable web-based databases. It has one of the best and most comprehensive lists of countries for which it tracks GDP data. The International Money Fund also provides GDP data through its multiple databases such as World Economic Outlook and International Financial Statistics. Another highly reliable source of GDP data is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The OECD not only provides historical data but also forecasts GDP growth. The disadvantage of using the OECD database is that it tracks only OECD member countries and a few non-member countries. Thank you all for watching. We hope this video helps you understand a little bit about GDP.